Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Philbrick. I'm Director of Campus Operations here at USM's Lewiston Auburn College, and on behalf of Dean Joyce Gibson, the faculty and staff of Lewiston Auburn College, I'd like to welcome you all to the first of an ongoing lecture series that's presented by the Community Advisory Board of Lewiston Auburn College. Now, the goal of this series is to bring back USM LAC alumni so they may speak about how they are applying their degree to their current occupations and organizations. Our speaker today is Sergeant Jonathan Shapiro from the Maine State Police. Sergeant Shapiro is a 24-year state police veteran whose career consisted of rural patrol, canine handler, troop detective, and homicide detective. He is currently stationed with Troop A. Sergeant Shapiro graduated with a master's degree in leadership studies from USM LAC, and his capstone project for his master's degree focused on law enforcement's response to juveniles in crisis. He is the recipient of the 2013 Maine State Police Colonel's Award, the 2013 Reverend Howe's CSI Visionary Leadership Award, the 2011 Keeping Maine's Children Connected Leadership Award, and the 2009 Southern Maine Parenting Leadership Award. Sergeant Shapiro was also instrumental in the formulation of USM LAC's emergency procedure plan for this campus. Join me in welcoming Sergeant Jonathan Shapiro.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today, and I'm pleased to be here today. I feel like I'm back under the requirements of my graduate program and providing maybe a defense to my capstone. How's that? But anyway, when I started my graduate program, I actually had a full head of hair, and what I did have wasn't gray. That goes both to the length that it took me to get my degree and to the rigors of the program that we had. But I made it through. I actually. Anyway, it was a very enjoyable 5 years it took me to do this. I drove up here once a week for each semester, and vowed when I drove up here the last time it would be a long time before I did it again. So, but here I am back again. I believe it was Carlito's Way that whenever I think I'm out, they pull me back in. So here I am again, but I am pleased. It's been 4 years since I had the honor of graduating from this program, and the capstone that I did was meaningful and was directly related to the skills and the ability, the knowledge that I received from the good education at USM LA campus. How this project came about, and I'm going to talk freely, and if anybody has any questions at any point, just feel free to ask. We're a nice tight group here today, so we can have a good conversation. And if anything that I say at any time that you don't understand or you disagree with, which I would be shocked at, you can feel free to confront me with that, or we'll have a dialogue. But at any rate, I was assigned to the District 1 Shared Youth Vision Council, and as a law enforcement representative. And this was back in about 2004, 2005. And while we were there, we had to have a round table, and everybody had to talk about their dealings with youth and if there were any issues, and then we all discussed it. So I had to rack my brain every time when I was there what I was going to say, because I don't particularly, as a uniformed state police sergeant in a supervisory position, deal one-on-one with youth that often. But I did notice a troubling trend where I was seeing a lot of calls come in about so-called children out of control, and we were responding to those. So I brought that up, every week. I said, "Oh, I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that." And around the table were people from DHHS, Department of Corrections, DOE, social services, and they would all throw suggestions at me. You can do this, you can do that, you can do that. And they were all good suggestions, but they weren't helpful in regard to how do you approach this situation from a systemic manner. It's good for me to have that, but how does anybody else know about that? So I thought about that, and then of course at the same time I had to come up with an idea for the capstone. So I put the two together, and I said, wow, this actually could work. So if you know anything about the leadership program, it stresses shared leadership, collaboration, all things which I'm very bad at, or was very bad at, and because I prefer, as most AAA type personality people, to do everything individually and singularly and alone in the best way possible by my own standards, which isn't unusual, quite frankly, for most organizations, but particularly police, because we all hire and select a certain type of person, which is very driven to do things a certain way. So anyway, it became very clear to me that in order for me to move forward, I had to do something along the lines of collaboration, bring in a lot of stakeholders, get a lot of input, and take a look at what we were, well, look at that. I hope that doesn't do that for the whole program, because it's going to take a long time to do that. So the result of it was we had to come up with an idea. I had to come up with an idea of how do I improve the response that we're giving to kids in crisis. My poster child for this was one case that I tracked, and between us and another agency, we responded to this house 52 times over a period of 4 years. And I took a hard look at that about how we responded to that individually for each police officer, each agency, and what the end result was. And the scary thing was that no matter what happened there, the end result was always the same. We arrived, we saw what happened. The officer, depending upon their individual abilities, really wasn't sure how to handle that call. They approach it almost always as if, first, is it a criminal call? Is there a crime committed here? What can we do? If not, what's the default? Well, maybe there's some mental health issue going on here. If it is, what do we do? Not sure. So there was three things that happened every time. Was either they went in and they charged the child with something and referred to Department of Corrections, or they took the child in for emergency mental health evaluation, or they did nothing, and then they left. And then we were guaranteed we were going to be back there the next week because that was just the singular approach of the police officer arriving, dealing with a situation that they weren't completely sure of how to deal with, worked within their frame of knowledge, and then left. So what we determined was that there was no uniformity of how police approached these calls. There was ambiguity about what the call really was, and operating individualistically, unilaterally on these calls was problematic. And through conversations with parents and conversations with all the stakeholders at hand, what we found was there was a huge amount of misunderstanding, expectations that were unrealistic, not only between the parents calling the police, but between stakeholders. The Department of Health and Human Services had a misunderstanding what police can or could do, or what their level of training was. Crisis services that were sometimes involved was the same thing. The parents called, and usually what the parents wanted was help, not necessarily that the child was going to be charged, not even necessarily the child was going to go to the hospital, but they just wanted help. Now, you remember they're calling a trooper or a police officer for that, and the expectation is for some reason that we're no longer law enforcement, we have some level of expertise in dealing with childhood mental health issues. Which we, at that point, we did not, and we really, in general, we still do not. So, the overall look at that was there was misunderstandings between stakeholders, misunderstandings between all parties involved. There was a gap in communication between what the police would use for language and what other agencies would use for language, and what information everybody needed in order to act definitively with the child. So I decided to take a look at this through research, and thought that there had to be something out there nationally or internationally that would address this issue. And when I looked, I found that there really wasn't anything out there. At the time that I looked at this, the Crisis Intervention Team Training, which is an adult model for out of Memphis, Tennessee, was developed in the late 80s, but it really was for adults, and it was designed for really an urban setting where you had the luxury of having a mental health professional ride with you and be able to interface with the call. We obviously don't have that in the vast areas of Maine. We don't have that in rural areas where we're patrolling, and you certainly don't have that 24/7. So that model was as good as far as it went. They were trying, at the time that I was looking at this, to institute a child crisis intervention team training, but again, it was very similar in regard to the adult model, where it relied very much on having a liaison person with you and an infrastructure that was much more urbanized than what we have in Maine, a rural setting in Maine. Now, the question comes up, why are we dealing with these type of calls to begin with anyway? What's happened in society that these are the calls that we're dealing with? And if you look historically for juvenile issues, you'll find that juvenile crime in general in the 60s and 70s was pretty static, 50s, 60s, 70s. And when you got into the 80s, you had a very high peak increase in juvenile delinquency and criminal conduct. And then that peak hit its high point in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it precipitously dropped from that point on. When that peak happened in the 80s, all the policymakers and the lawmakers decided that we really, and at the same time, you got to remember there was a crack epidemic going on, and there was a lot of laws and procedures that were put in place that were very hardline procedures, zero tolerance type things, 3 strikes and you're out types of issues. So you end up having a lot of juveniles entering the criminal justice system. Prior to 1990, and what they noticed when they had this huge influx of kids into the prison system, that they felt that there was more going on than just bad behavior, and they felt that there might be some underlying mental health issues there. And prior to 1990, there was no testing, there was no uniform testing of kids going into the corrections for mental health issues. Post-1990, they started doing that. That's good on for two reasons. One, for my purposes doing the capstone, there really wasn't an awful lot of information on this, so it was pretty contained. And there really was no baseline on any of this, so most of the material was fairly new. But the result of it is that they determined, and because there was a lot of validity issues with the testing, how good was the testing, how good was the screening, but the broad answer was, when they started testing, was between 50 to 100%, and those are the numbers, 50 to 100%. Everybody agrees on about 70% of kids that are involved with corrections have at least one diagnosable mental health issue, and the vast majority of them have co-occurring disorders, particularly with substance abuse involved there. So that's a huge issue. Mental health with children, huge issue. So this mental health issue with kids got on the radar. People started realizing, professionals started realizing that this was a real issue. At the same time, although we were throwing a lot of kids in large facilities, we also had deinstitutionalization, particularly with mental health, but also a shift with kids as you progress through the 90s into the 2000s, of putting kids in the community in the least restrictive care setting. So, and at the same time, you also had a precipitous drop in actual delinquency, criminal conduct by kids. So what you had was a drop in criminality as you went through the 90s, and an increase in deinstitutionalization. So what you wound up having in the community was a lot of kids with mental health issues. Therefore, you have a lot of calls from parents to the police and other social service agencies for children that have mental health issues. I started in the early 1989, but I started right at the peak. If you look at the data of juvenile delinquency or criminality, 1989 to about 1993, 94. When I started, most of the issues I dealt with was actual real crime: burglaries, car thefts, arson, assault. That was when I was a uniformed trooper. As I moved through my career and got off the road, things changed, maybe because I was no longer doing it. But as I moved through, and then there you go, 15 years later, as a supervisor looking at this, the change, what you see is that there was a drop in this criminality and an uptick in the mental health aspect. So that's the broad background that we're talking about for criminality versus mental health issues. So when we did the case study in regard to what are we looking at when a police officer rolls into a scene, and we're trying to determine where the gaps are, and what we determined was clearly a gap in knowledge. The police officer looked at it predominantly from a perspective of, was there a crime committed? When the reality was the call was much more complicated than that. We also realized that in order to fix this, we had to have a method of communicating with other agencies, so we created the Police Juvenile Reporting Form, which is a form that was created with each of the stakeholders advising the police what information they needed to act definitively. And then at the end, the program created a follow-up by a partnership with Crisis in York County, where they would always reach back to the family once a referral was made. And the uniformity of the information that was captured was one form could go to the district attorney's office, to the social service, to our own police records, the juvenile correction officer, or to parents. The parents a lot of times would be asking for information on the call, and we're able to provide that to them. And we talked about that. One of the main issues that we ran into as well with the deinstitutionalization, which in general is a good idea, but it's only good if you have the community supports in place to support that. And that's also true on the adult side. And what we're finding is that Maine actually does have a fairly robust community services if you know how to access it, if you know who to call, when to call, and how to use it. And that does work until a certain level of criticality in regard to the mental health problem. And then that's where it starts to break down, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into it. As far as the overall scope of the problem, when I first started this, the numbers I got, you could see, were about 1,000 calls a year to York County Crisis Services. As you move forward to 2010 to 2013, you're now pushing 1,500, 1,600, 1,700 calls. So the trend hasn't abated at all in regards to kids with mental health issues, accessing services. And as you can see, on the average, you're talking 139 juveniles per month for the 46-month period are accessing the services through a variety of ways, but that's a substantial number. These numbers are grossly underestimated. When I started the program, we're looking at the state police were getting about 5 calls per month. The sheriff's department, which had a slightly larger area, was getting 7 calls per month. Everybody subjectively agreed it was probably double that. And if you're talking about calls for service or volume of why is it worth looking at this problem, that's more than we actually have for accidents controlled for weather events. So we're actually responding to something like this on such a regular basis, and yet there really is a complete lack of understanding of what the dynamics of the call is. So when I started talking about this with my troopers and fellow officers out there about when they're responding to it, what do they really view this call as? And the answer is it's a nuisance call. It's a pain in the neck in regard to I'm having to go to parent this child. They looked at it as a discipline call. The parent, doesn't know how to discipline the child, so they're calling the police to discipline the child. And in some ways, they're not actually wrong with that, because the parent actually will call us a lot of times because the way they're disciplining the child doesn't work, so they think, we'll get somebody here in uniform that can actually discipline the child and get the child to behave properly, which obviously is problematic from the get-go. But that's what does happen. And again, as far as the police profession, we're sending officers into a call like this that really don't have a good knowledge of what they're dealing with when they're dealing with children with these issues. So the reality of it is what we found out was that the police officer really needed to be educated on what a child mental health call looked like, and what a call for a so-called 10-year-old out of control, what that really is. Is that a parental discipline issue? Is that a nuisance call for you, or how should you be viewing that so that you can understand the dynamics that are going to take place there? And what we found was that if you break the call down into several different areas, the first thing you look at is, has there been an overt crime committed? Yes, no. Is there an underlying mental health issue there? Yes, no. Is there a jeopardy issue there in regard to the safety of the family? Is there a neglect issue there where the family isn't actually providing the care for the child? And then the other issue is it a combination of all these things to a certain degree? And the answer usually is it's a combination of almost everything involved there, one way or the other, which, if you think about it, is very complicated to actually work through. And most of that issue actually is outside the realm of the police to actually definitively do anything with. So So again, you have the issue of what do you do with that. So we start with what is the definition, and it's a child that's less than 18 years old who displays one or more of the following behaviors: disruptive, destructive, violent, criminal, self-harming, threatening, assaultive, or substance abusing. And that really fits, a very broad spectrum. And NAMI's definition, which I like to put at the bottom, any situation in which a child's behavior puts them at risk of hurting themselves or others, or when the parent isn't able to resolve the situation with the skills and resources available. Now that last line is huge, because what we find a lot of the times is that children that have challenging behaviors, what generates the problem is the parent actually trying to use traditional discipline with the child. And a child that has either processing issues or has challenging behaviors that emotionally or through some mental capacity issues is not able to comply with the parent, and the parent forces that issue, frustration builds up, and what we like to call, and some people don't like the term, the child has a meltdown, which really can be quite violent, and that's usually when we get the phone call, and then there's a cycle to that, and then after the meltdown occurs, there's about 20 minutes of very violent behavior a lot of times, and then the child comes out of that, and then they're very calm and they're very demure because they're exhausted. And that's really the cycle. And a lot of these issues happen over really minor things, like the child won't go to bed on time, the child won't turn the TV off, the child won't do the dishes, and then there's an argument. And this is what you'll get over the radio is, my 10-year-old refused to do the dishes, and now they're tearing the house apart, and we need police help right away. And that's actually, those are some of the verbiage that we'll come across. And almost all these calls actually follow that pattern. So the first thing everybody thinks is, well, the parent just needs to control the child. But when you actually start asking the questions, and then what questions do you ask? So we provide those questions to ask to the officer. You find out that there is an underlying mental health issue going on there. And what we also found, and we've handled almost 200 kids over the 4 years, is that at least half of these kids have absolutely no services in place now at all. So the first call for help that they made is the 911 call to the police officer. So it's critical that the police officer, when they approach this, actually has a baseline understanding. So what we did is that, and we talked about this, what we did is that we created a lesson plan that educates the police officer to recognize what a juvenile crisis is, and that was the definition, that they understand the surrounding causal factors, which is what I just spoke about. Vast majority of these calls are that way, where there's a meltdown over something that's fairly innocuous, but it can be quite violent. And then the other question comes in, everybody says, well, what's a tantrum? It's a tantrum. And so is there a difference between a tantrum and a meltdown? And tantrums really are a controlling technique by the child to get the parent to do what they want. A meltdown really is, by our definitions anyway, is something that's not controllable by the child. And quite frankly, you don't get called for a tantrum. You get called when the parent really is at their wit's end on trying to control the child so they don't hurt themselves or someone else. So the next crucial step is what information do you need to capture to document properly. Police officers, when they roll into a call, will only document the facts of the circumstances based upon what is a crime that took place, just the facts, and not the surrounding issues that took place, which is more of a social service role. But what we found through discussion was that if we wanted another agency to act on any of this, we had to actually capture that information up front. So a lot of the pushback that I got from police is, why am I doing somebody else's job? Excuse me. And the reason why you're doing somebody else's job is because if you don't do that, initially they're not going to do anything with this child, the chances are, and you're going to be right back there in another 2 nights. And the pushback on the form, which I have some copies if anybody wants to see it, is it takes too long or whatever. It actually takes no longer than filling out, again, an accident report. So for some reason, the accident report is in our lexicon. We understand that's what we do. That's okay to take 10 minutes to fill that out. But to fill out a form on a child with a mental health issue is anathema. Oh my God, we don't have the time to do this. So again, it's a learning curve to get through that. And then the next huge issue, obviously, is how do we communicate with other agencies in a meaningful way, and that, again, was the police juvenile reporting form where each of the stakeholders said, if you want me to do something with this child, this is the information I need to have. And if you fill it out and you send it to me, then you have a much better shot of me being able to provide the services to the family. And one of the other things that's very significant about the reporting form is that it actually has a very gross analysis in there for the level of crisis, red flag indicators. And it's the only one that I know of nationally that actually has a pre-arrest assessment of the child in regard to what their level of mental health needs are. So one of my passions right now in the venues that different boards that I sit on is that in Maine and in most states, the mechanism to get services to a family is and to a child is the charging mechanism. So you have to charge a child with a crime to get them into the system to get help that they need. And I reject that. I think that we should be able to get help to families and children without charging them. And that's a little tricky to do because of a lot of different privacy issues and whatnot. But in this circumstance, where it's a mental health call, where it's identified basically as an emergency call, you can capture this information and you can pass it on to the correct people. Now I bring that up only, and I don't know if anybody read the paper today, but there was an article in there, fake firearms bans for school, which again, objectively, I think most police officers would look at it, and maybe most citizens would think it's a good idea that if you have a look-alike gun or a toy gun that looks like a real gun, it should be a crime to bring it to school. I personally feel, the more laws you have, the more criminals you're going to have, and this is a prime example of that. Where I go Christmas shopping and have a toy gun in the back of my car, and technically I'd be in violation bringing it onto the school grounds. The thought process behind it, I understand, certainly because you don't want to be confronted by a look-alike gun on school grounds for all the reasons. But what was very interesting when you read this article, and this is real time today, I cut it out this morning, is that one of the arguments is that they had a student that brought a look-alike gun in Elliott to school, and that student, it comes out in the article, actually had an underlying mental health issue. And they brought it to school because they thought that if they were going to be confronted by somebody, that it would be protection for them, which is another issue in and of itself. But the SRO stated in their testimony that they felt the only way they could get help for this child was to be able to charge them with this offense of taking this toy gun to school, but there is no law there, so they couldn't charge, therefore they couldn't get help to the child. Now, there's all kinds of issues about whether that's an accurate assessment or not, but that's, number one, is the belief of a lot of professionals. In part, some of it is a little bit true, that you will get services if you charge, but shame on us if it's not ubiquitously known that you can actually get good services to kids without charging them with a felony or a misdemeanor. So anyway, that's real time, that's today, that was testimony that happened yesterday, just to show that there is a need for education for police officers and a conversation between stakeholders so these type of misunderstandings don't take place. So what we did is we created a protocol for officers to arrive. Everything we do in police work of any note has a procedure and a protocol to it, other than responding to a juvenile that has a mental health issue. So we outline this in a lesson plan for them. You gather, you make the scene safe, obviously, you separate parties, you get the appropriate information, and then it gives you a list of steps that you can take. What can you do? You can take transport to for a mental health evaluation. You can refer to crisis, refer to Department of Health and Human Services. You can provide information to the parent. You can always charge the juvenile, which is what we just talked about. You can talk to the juvenile corrections officer, or you can do all those things up above. There's a lot of things in your toolbox when you really think about what you can do. We did work with the GEAR Family Advocacy Group, and they created, at the same time that I was doing this, we worked together, we created two forms. One to go to police departments on how you respond to these calls, so you can just give it to the police department, and one to go to parents to what they to expect when a police officer actually shows up. And they actually do their own trainings that mirror my final product on this, which I thought was a great collaboration between us and the Family Advocacy Group. One aside to that was when I developed the reporting form, the first form that I created and roughed out, I presented to them to get a parental, yes?
What does refer to crisis mean?
Crisis services, each place them around the state geographically as a crisis services. That's for. And I presented the form to them to see what the parent takeaway would be, and I was lucky to get out of the room intact. The form was, I guess, very offensive, and they weren't happy with it at all. But to their credit, they didn't stop the conversation. They talked about improvements and suggestions for language and questions to ask. And the end result of the police drill reporting form that we came up with, I have not had, out of all the families we've used this on, one complaint from a family. I've had, quite the contrary, I've unsolicited phone calls praising the fact that the officer actually captured all the relevant information that they wanted to provide, but in the height of the crisis they often left out. And they actually wanted a copy of the form themselves so they could take it to their own physicians and or counselors so that they'd have a concise body of information to be able to pass along. And again, this isn't my doing. This was the fact that I was, through USM's great tutelage, willing to listen to what their request was about how to approach parents. So I mean, it really was huge. That same group, I asked when I got there was about 15 of them that met with me. How many of their children were in they're different age parents, or some were young, some were quite old with adult children. I said, how many of your children have been in prison? And out of the 15, 3/4 of them raised their hand. And then those that didn't raise their hand said, well, they're too young to be in prison, but they're going to be in prison. So that's another wake-up call in regard to if you're not dealing with these problems very early, if you're not recognizing that a child and or family is in crisis at the earliest possible stage, it's almost guaranteed that this child's going to wind up in prison as an adult. All the data and all the science, all the research shows, if you're able to get those services, that intervention in early enough, you can change that trajectory of the child's life. And then the other issue that we know, based on the most current brain development studies that are out there now, is that the brain does do a reset. You do have opportunities to change the trajectory of that child if you get the proper treatment in at the proper times, and especially at the proper stages when that brain is going through a rewiring and restructuring and re-energizing. Now, something that I'm very interested in looking at, and I was hoping to have the data today, but I don't. We're just coming to the 4-year mark of this, and I gave all my data over to 2 people that have been watching this to analyze for me, but the charts for each individual year, I watch when our peak calls for service are. And our peak calls for service by age for each juvenile actually mirrors loosely peaks in brain development time. So we have, we first start getting calls around 7, maybe 8 years old, but really 10, boom, big peak. Then we have a big peak at like 14, and then we have a big peak at like 16, and then it just keeps going up from there. And if you do that over when the spurts of growth are, you see that those two things go together, which again is really rich for some research on how do you respond to that. It's certainly going to be some degree of correlation there, and how do you address that issue when you know these two things are going on at the same time. The other issue with brain development, just as an aside, they're saying now that you're not fully, your judgment isn't fully formed until you're about 25 years old, which is kind of scary when you consider most police officers becoming police officers from 21 to 24. And you really got to rethink that. But the reality of that is, how do we deal with criminality and wrongdoing of juveniles, and as under 18 really where we want to be with juveniles. Maine is looking at a youthful offender law which categorizes a separate group for 18 to 24-year-olds, which I think is appropriate, because I do think that if we handle those issues differently based upon the science that we now know, we can probably change the trajectory of 20-year-olds as much as we can 12-year-olds. So that's huge. That's huge. So we created a lesson plan, as I said, for the police officers, and what I did was I created it in a way where each domain wrote a little part of it so that they couldn't blame each other for the other part not knowing what the other one was saying. So we all sat in a room, district attorney's office, social service, and the police, and we wrote what each domain needed and how to interface that information with each other. Because usually when you get trained separately. district attorney will come in and talk to you, and then a DHHS person, a social service person will come in and talk to you, and then a police officer will talk to you, all on separate days, separate training. But they all will say, you know, one way or another, suggest it's going to be difficult working with other agencies. Well, I said, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to actually write a unified lesson plan together, and each of us are going to discuss how we interface with each other. And that's what we did. And the reality of it was, the result again was the creating of a police reporting form where when each party has information, we can unify the language and not necessarily overlap each other, but make a very porous barrier between the two of us where there's a seamless flow of information between each other. And we all have the same information, and we all have it in real time. So that we're able to roll into a scene, we're able to fill this form out while we're at the scene electronically, we're able to email it and send it electronically to the powers to be, and they're all looking at the same information at the same time, and then there can be a good decision made on the level of criticality in that family at that point in time. And maybe something needs to be done immediately that night, or maybe just a follow-up the next morning. And what we found with being able to do this, number one, charging rates went way down in regard to what the appropriateness of a criminal charge would be. Transporting the child for emergency evaluation went way down because the supports were there, and we knew that we weren't going to be able, we didn't really need that level of care in there, and that we were guaranteed with immediate follow-up. I received a phone call from a woman the other day that was referred to me, and we had never responded to her house for a child, but she said, I'll tell you right now, she said, you haven't responded yet, but you will. And I have a 12-year-old that I don't know what I'm going to do with, very violent, very poor grades in school. I'm afraid to leave them alone. The latest incident, he took a butcher knife and destroyed my kitchen with it. I'm afraid for my other children in the home. I don't know what to do. They said to call you. Now that in and of itself is scary. I mean, they're calling a sergeant of the state police because they have this problem, and she's lamenting she can't get services in place. So I talked to her on the phone. I filled this form out on the phone. I says, I'll get you help. I sent it off. When I hung up with her, she called me back the next day. She says, I have an appointment and an evaluation for tomorrow morning. They took me in. I saw a child psychiatrist, evaluated my child, and we have meds that have been prescribed, and we just picked them up today. All basically within 48 hours.
I think you should mention the surprise of some of the community mental health folks when you were first getting them together, that this was a police initiative.
Yeah, well, again, I think that most of the stakeholders in this are used to police in general working fairly individually, unilaterally, and in their own silos. And one of the shocks was why is the police orchestrating this? And they were surprised that there was somebody like myself that actually wanted to work cross-domain and create something, a partnership, where we're able to address a very serious problem. So anyway, so the result of this little vignette of this woman with this 12-year-old highlights even a larger problem where most parents that have children with challenging behaviors, it takes a long time to get a diagnosis, and it takes a long time to get services in place. And I gave a talk the other night at the community college, and I had two parents in the room that echoed this and said they both had children with challenging behaviors, multiple contacts with police. It took them years to get a good diagnosis, and it took them years to get services in place. And by that time, the kids were almost in the adult realm. This process here that we developed gets these kids on the radar very early. It gets the services in place very early. And what it does, which nobody else does, is it actually has a level of accountability in regard to, if we keep going back, we've created a feedback loop, that the accountability is that if you're providing a service and the police have to keep going back, then obviously the service you're providing isn't sufficient. And my position on that is it's not the police's role to go back to deal with the default of the mental health system because you're not providing the services. Because every time a police officer shows up at your front door, there's always an inherent risk there of what's going to happen. And nobody wants to say that, nobody wants to acknowledge that, but you think that we show up with special tools for 10-year-olds, we don't. We have the same tools that we deal with when we deal with 24-year-olds and 30-year-olds, and they're not pleasant, and you don't want to be dealing with them. With a 10-year-old, I Googled to highlight that point this morning, and I got 4 articles of police departments around the country tasing 10 and 8-year-old, tasing or pepper spraying 10 or 8-year-olds because they're out of control. There's 4 different instances here from all across the country: Colorado, Arkansas, Minnesota. And again, these are the tools that we have, and when you call the police, absent of really good de-escalation training, absent of a really good training program or something along these lines, those are the tools that you have. So when you create a crisis plan, and the first step on it is, well, when the plan for the child doesn't work, call the police. That's not a good crisis plan in my opinion. And a lot of that, and I'm not saying this as a pejorative against the social services, again, this led because it was ignorance of what the police would do when they actually showed up and what their expectations were of the police. So we had to have a conversation that when you create a crisis plan, don't create a plan in the house where you're gonna cause that child to act out to such a violent degree that your default is going to be to call the police. That's a planned crisis. I reject that. I'll respond to a crisis. I'm not going to respond to a crisis that you intentionally made, particularly when the risks are this high when you're dealing with a young child. And that may sound like it's a hard line and that this is going to be an impossibility. It's really not. When we had these conversations, that changed dramatically. And one of the things that were driving these calls was the people that created crisis plans for children with challenging behavior, the default was call the police because it was accepted that that was okay. There's a better way to do it. It takes a conversation. It takes, yes?
Part of the crisis management for the children are the parents also getting medication.
One of the agreements we had with the crisis services of York County is that when they did the follow-up was they're educating of the parent of when it was appropriate to call 911 for police response and when it was appropriate to call directly social services to get a crisis response. And there was a conflating of those two issues. And oftentimes what they wanted was a counselor, but they called the police. When you call the police officer always going to show up. Or they'd call crisis and say, this is what I have, and crisis understanding of what we would do or what we could supply would call us to go in. And they were really overutilizing our services inappropriately for the call that was at hand when they could have handled it without police involvement, which is my goal really is that a child in crisis really the default is not that they have to deal with a uniformed police officer in that situation. If we can preclude that at all, if we can mitigate that, if we can reduce that, that really should be the gold standard. It's just not a healthy situation, and it shouldn't be, the police response shouldn't be a default for a lacking mental health system. And really to date, it doesn't need to be. What we found when we did this, that there was 3 groups of families. There was families that didn't have any services, that needed certain services desperately, and we were able to get them those services quickly. We found that there were families that had services and the services weren't working, so we were able to provide a level of accountability on that and say you need to change the services, mix it up so that the child isn't going into crisis at home. And then there were families that didn't have services and refused to get them. And again, through the training plan that we put together, if you understand the tipping point for the Department of Health and Human Services, you start looking at that might be a neglect issue. The other issue for DHHS is if there's other children in the house that are being harmed by this child, that becomes a jeopardy issue for the other children. So that's a conversation that needs to be had when you're looking at the dynamics of those 3 different families. The other thing that we found is that 50% of the calls we were never called back once they got services. So as long as we were able to link them with sufficient services, they were off our radar completely. The other group, we would get called back maybe 2 or 3 times until we got the services right. And then the last group was the very high-end calls where the push policy-wise and monetarily to keep everybody in the home was significant, but the behavior was very high. And absence of a paper trail, which most mental health calls don't have with police, absence of a very good paper trail and a tracking of how you interface and inform the other systems, you can't get that child into a long-term residential setting. This system really facilitates that. And I'd say out of let's say we use numbers of 1 to 100 children, I'd say probably anywhere from 3 to 5 needed long-term residential. The rest were found to be at home, and that's good. That's where they should be, at home. But those 5 can cause an awful lot of damage and chew up an awful lot of police resources if they're inappropriately in the community. And those children that, when we have the conversations about do they need a higher level of care in a secured facility, a mental health facility, there was no disagreement around the table between all the stakeholders that the child actually did need a higher level of care. The question was, how are we going to get them that care? Because you had to fight to use those resources to get the child in there. And with good documentation and good collaboration and everybody writing a letter saying, yeah, this is what's needed, we were able to get that level of care. So I'm not going to, I wanted to play a clip. I don't know if anybody saw the 60 Minutes the other night that actually talked about the national problem with juveniles and mental health issues. And there's a 6-minute clip, but we only have 10 minutes to go, so I'm not going to play that. But what it does is it highlights that it's a national problem. It highlights that there's still, around the country, and even in the state of Maine, other than my area, there's really no uniform way of responding to these calls. And these calls can be dangerous, they can be costly, and the long-term negative effects on the child can be huge. So anyway, so to wrap everything up, the system that we put in place educated police officers on how to respond to the call. It gave them a format to collect appropriate information. It gave them a system between stakeholders to be able to work together to get the proper services in place. And it also provided a feedback loop that if there was a breakdown there, that there was a check on that, and how do you address that collaboratively with each other so that the child doesn't slip through the cracks. So, any questions? Yes.
Hi, Jonathan Shapiro.
Hi.
Christy Hammer.
Yes.
I guess I'm interested in a big picture piece. So this is juvenile policing and mental health. And I'm wondering what flashpoints are happening now in Maine and the country with policing, law enforcement, and education. I saw you mention, working with schools. I remember sitting by the head of education at the Concord State Pen when I was interested in corrections education, beyond making license plates and that kind of stuff, and trying to reform that. And I said, besides class, because I know most people in prison are mostly economic status, so I knew that was, I said, besides the denominator of class status, what else is a common denominator among people? The 10,000 or whatever at that time was in New Hampshire State Pen, and immediately he said, undiagnosed learning disability.
Yep.
And that has just stuck with me for such a long time. And so I know you talked about it was policing in the mental health, but what are are there ways that law enforcement, because that's the prevention, right, not the intervention. If that was the case, and if we didn't fail so many kids in our schooling system, so what's law enforcement and education? Are they trying to work more collaboratively?
Well, education is a so to speak, a tough nut to crack, because there's a lot of privacy issues, and the two worlds don't get together. Now, my other project is the Juvenile Community Review Board, which is a restorative disciplinary board that can hear school discipline and or criminal actions that bridges the community and the school together in a collaborative matrix. And I did that explicitly for that reason, is that one of the things in this program I tried very hard was to have school at the table, and they were at the table, but I couldn't work with them because without waivers and lengthy 15-page sign-offs that the parents had to do to share the information, it was too laborious to bring them into the loop. So at one point, and I didn't get the email back in time, Crisis was through a separate program that I had some input in, when they got this reporting form, were to ask the parent if they could share with the school that the child had a crisis over the weekend, let's say, and bring those two together, and then they would do all the signing of the appropriate paperwork to be able to have that conversation. And they did do that. It's not perfect. I don't think they had high fidelity to it, and they did it a lot, because there's a lot of barriers with trying to communicate with the school about the child criminally and or with the mental health field. The SRO is a backdoor way around that. I only say that because police can communicate with police, so I can tell the police officer in the school that there's an issue. whether or not that police officer can tell the school there was an issue is another problem altogether. So one of the things I would really much like to see, and I know there's a lot of concerns about privacy, is some ability for us to be able to share with school professionals, or at least somebody in the school, these issues. Because you're absolutely right, the school-to-prison pipeline is huge. If a child doesn't have education, it's a one-to-one guarantee. They're probably going to wind up in prison. The more days that they miss for truancy, they're going to wind up in prison. You know, and those are some of the questions, too, that we ask on the reporting form is, you know, is the child going to school? Are they in the proper grade for the age? Now, these are questions a police officer is never going to ask. Just like substance abuse, unless you're dealing with a substance abuse issue, we don't ask, do you have a substance, you know, is there suspected substance abuse in the house for the child, or are you using? But because if that's not the crime we're actually investigating, we don't really ask that. But if that's on there, if that's documented that there might be a substance abuse issue, people will take a much more difficult, harder look at that juvenile because the criticality goes much higher. So those are some very quick questions you can ask of a child and find out how much they're into crisis. Are they going to school? Are they in the right grade? Is there substance abuse issues there? And this is like a list of questions to ask to find out where that kid is and to get those proper early interventions in place. Yes.
People are all across the nation are kind of wringing their hands what to do about school shootings and the level of violence. To me, what you're doing right here is this is the kind of a model, I think, and I think it is appropriate that the police, because this is really, I think this model is going to have a huge impact, and it reminds me a little bit of like when domestic violence, when there was that kind of collaborative effort there, and I think it made a difference in this, and I feel very hopeful, and I think that that you really somehow have understood that level of isolation and fear and awfulness that parents go through when they have a child in this kind of crisis, and it's just remarkable.
Well,
I'm very
thank you.
pleased to hear you're made.
Two things on that. Parents have a very, very tough road to hoe when they have a child with challenging behaviors, because there's a lot of judgment out there, there's a lot of misconception out there, there's a lot of negative feedback from an uneducated police officer rolling in that has an attitude that, why can't you discipline your 10-year-old? We have police departments that will say, I don't want my officers responding. And I'm not saying that, I was there 10 years ago. This call with the 52 kids, 52 calls with this 12-year-old, I started off saying, we're not going to put that child on the school bus for you. What do you want from us? Because I was as ignorant as anybody else of what this call really was. 52 calls later, the child's no longer, actually it started earlier, because at the second call the child was 12 and decided, had an outburst and attacked the mother with a brass candlestick and put her in the hospital and was charged ultimately with a major felony, elevated aggravated assault. And quite frankly, that's because the 52 times we intervened before, we didn't do a sufficient job. And that was out of ignorance. That wasn't out of malfeasance. It wasn't out of anything else. It was out of a complete misreading of what this call really is. That when someone's calling, say they have a child, and it's out of control, they don't know what to do, the first thing we ought to be thinking is there a mental health issue going on here? Is it undiagnosed? And what level of help does the parents need? And these aren't obviously bad people. These are actually caring. All of the parents that we've dealt with are caring people. Otherwise, they wouldn't call. Unfortunately, we don't get calls from some of the lower demographics because they don't really care. They just assume, shove the kid out the door as opposed to, having some interventions there. That's bad in and of itself. But the families that are actually calling us are seeking help. They want help. They want assistance. They're loving, caring parents. They're just desperate to know what to do. Yes?
So, which communities in the state are using this model?
Well,
Does Lewiston use this model?
no. And again, the State Police Troop A, we use this model because that's where I am. The Kennebunk Police Department uses this model to a certain degree. And I was just told not too long ago that there is an agency in another state that I met this gentleman at restorative justice training, and they're using it with a lot of success. And I got that secondhand from somebody. So that's really the only venues it's being used. And again, the issue is still statewide, my own department included, a misunderstanding of what these calls really are. And depending upon how you view them and understand them, it's how much do we want to be involved with them. And then the question is, do you want to deal with the 12-year-old or do you want to deal with the 18-year-old? Because you're going to deal with the same child if you don't get the preventative measures in place. And I'd much rather deal with a 10-year-old than an 18-year-old that's much bigger, stronger, and better looking than I am. Because you can affect some more positive change in a much easier way, younger than older, obviously.
I mean, I'm just thinking, in places where we talk about community policing, that this could be a really effective means to sort of go about that.
Yes, I mean, it's effective wherever you are. I mean, the reality of it is, which again was another thought process based upon my education, was, how do you get something like this in place when it's a cultural change within the organization? And what I did is I worked within the sphere of knowledge of the what's the routine for a police officer. What's a police officer do? They arrive to a call, they observe what happened, they document it, and then they send that report off. Well, that's all you have to do with this. You can be the crustiest, oldest, nastiest police officer that doesn't want to, that wants to be retired 10 years ago, and show up, and all you got to do is ask the questions on this form and mail it off to where you're supposed to mail it, and you've done a world of good. You've done an absolute world of good, much better than you would have done any other way, because now you're actually documenting that there's a child in crisis at some level. You're documenting at what level of crisis that they're at with the information you captured, and you're giving it to somebody that can actually do something about it. And you can have the worst attitude in the world and still do that as long as you fill out the form. And that's easy to supervise. Was this is the case, where's the form? So, and I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that it works through the guy that's really energetic about this to the guy that really doesn't want to do it. Just fill out the form. It's fill in the blank. It's pretty easy. You tab through it and send it off. So it's like anything else. You can take it as far as you want to go, or you can just show up, take the information, send it off. It's a lot better than what we're doing. The vast majority of mental health calls that you go to, adult and juvenile, at least in my experience and in my department, there's virtually no documentation. Because there's no crime committed, and if there's no assault or no major issue going on there, it may just be what we call, radio notes, CAD notes, that are shoved in the call for service. Mental health evaluation, voluntary transport to the hospital, done. Well, that's useless. Because you're going to write the exact same thing 3 nights later. Yes?
I just one more quick one if nobody else does. I wondered if there were any cross-cultural issues, particularly with our new Mainers, with the philosophy of juvenile justice and connection with mental health.
Well, where I work, it's almost completely, the demographics are such a way where there's really very, very little minority. So
Is your York now?
rural York County.
Yeah.
So there really isn't diversity where I am. I can see this being a much bigger issue, particularly if there's a language barrier, if there's a cultural barrier, which again, that's another area of mine, is the disproportionate minority contact, which is, in Maine, the numbers are very, very small, but persons of color in Maine get further involved, juveniles, in the juvenile justice system than the comparative level of Caucasians. So, why is that? Well, for all those reasons. There's cultural reasons, there's language reasons, there's availability of a guardian to be readily available because they may not have the technology, and that also fits for demographics too. If you're at the lower end of the socioeconomic demographics, your child's going to get sucked into the system more because of your availability and your ability as a guardian or parent to navigate the system. Yes?
Earlier on, you said that cops or officers would have to charge the crisis victims to give them help. Is that still going on?
Yes, absolutely. Maine is very progressive in its juvenile laws. It changed in the 70s from a punitive model to a therapeutic model. The problem with that is the vast majority of police officers really don't acknowledge that or understand that. And again, the training that we get in the Academy for Kids is very small. We deal mostly with adults. We're dealing with two demographics with what I'm talking about here that most police officers have difficulty dealing with: young people, juveniles, and people with mental health. And you have both in the same package. You have a kid with a mental health issue, and that's probably one of the areas that you're least trained to deal with. So obviously, like anybody else in any profession, if you have the least training in that area, that's not really what you want. your comfort zone, unless you take it upon yourself or you become an SRO. And even some, well, you know, this person here is an SRO and wanted to charge the kid that brought the toy gun to school. It's easy. It's easy because you know if you do charge the kid, they're going to go before a juvenile community corrections officer, and they're going to do a screening on the kid, and they'll get some help to that family. Again, that's a sad state of affairs that you actually have to charge a child criminally to give them mental health. Some parents, particularly in other states, that's what they'll do, is that they'll call the police, want the child charged so that they can actually get services that they can't access as a parent. You know, that's a narrative on the mental health system wherever they are. So that's still going on. It's still a viable mechanism for police officers to use, and they do use it, even though all the research and data out there suggests that you should never use the criminal justice system to leverage the mental health system. In an ideal world, we should not have to do that. I mean, why are we criminalizing an illness?
Also, doesn't that increase, like, I mean, obviously, mental health patients and others like that, they are being labeled as such. If they have that other label as a felon, doesn't that, you know, raise the risks of them just repeating that felony? Or just
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you should say that. Both things are stigmatizing. If you're diagnosed with a mental health issue, which you shouldn't be, obviously. I mean, we don't stigmatize people that have any other illness. We're going to stigmatize people with mental health issues. And we stigmatize people that have a criminal history, both of which have a very negative effect on their future, and both of which all but assure that they're probably going to wind right back up with systems involvement in a negative way. You know, that's another huge hurdle. You know, how do you deal with people that commit serious crime, and knowing that once you go down the path of charging somebody with a misdemeanor, it's the same thing today. If you charge with illegal transportation of drugs, if somebody has marijuana in the car and you're getting to charge a kid with that, that's an infraction that goes on their driver's history. That's not protected. Nobody thinks that thing through. So 10 years from now, when they go to get a job and somebody runs their driving record, it's going to show illegal transportation of alcohol, illegal transportation of drugs. For, you know, a joint that somebody else had in the car that's on the, you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't address that, but we really need to think through what we just do to that child that's 16 years old that had 4 kids in the car, or they themselves, you know, had an illegal substance in there. That's not, and it's because it's a civil infraction and it's not protected, and that's now on their driver's record. So there really needs to be sort of a paradigm shift on how we treat a lot of these behaviors. You know, I ask a lot of times in venues, you know, if you think about your own self, and I'm not asking anybody to raise their hand here, but between the ages of 12 and 18, you know, did you do anything that you might have been charged or arrested for that you just didn't get caught for? You know, and guess what? All of you here are, you know, fairly functioning adults, you know, working hard, paying taxes, and good citizens, right? What if you did get charged? What if you did get sucked into the system? What if you were labeled that way? You know, what would your shots have been? Would you have been able to go to college? Would you have been able to get a loan? You know, would you be able to get the job that you got? So there's huge ramifications of that those of us that are out in the field and those of us that make policy and make law don't often think about the unintended consequences. So anyway, thank you very much. It was great to be here.
I'd like to thank Jonathan for coming in again, and we have a token of our appreciation
great.
for you. Part of the series.
Oh, still?
It's filled with his glassware in there, so don't throw it in your car.
Oh, okay. Very good.
And thank you all for coming.